I'm super excited to be here. And you all are welcome to guess and send me an email which part of my life I was drinking 10 to 12 cups of coffee today. I wish we could talk more about coffee, but today we are going to talk about something more important and urgent, which is how do we design globally equitable AI technologies. And AI technologies are everywhere. They really dictate how we have conversations online, who we follow, who we don't, how do we get to places, the music which we are listening, and so on. But these AI technologies today are designed by and for weird people. And weird people like you and me in this room, which is an acronym for Western, industrialized, educated, rich, and democratic societies, people who are living in these societies. And the global population is critically underrepresented in current research advances, practice around AI, implementation, and governance. And I'll give you an example just from AI research. So if you look at what percentage of the world's population is weird, that's roughly 12 to 15%. And if you look at what kind of papers many of us are writing and submitting, then if places like HCI, like 73% of the findings are based on weird samples. At places like FACT, which is a premier venue for responsible AI-related work, 84% of findings are based on weird samples. And if you look at subfields of AI, like explainable AI, then 99% of papers are in weird contexts. And what really happens is then there are downstream impacts on how we think of AI, how we design AI, the products which we are building. And there are harmful stereotypes of underrepresented groups from non-weird context. I'm going to show you some images which people could build using text-to-image tools a couple of years back. And when you'll ask these tools, what does a Muslim man look like, then these were the typical representation. A very homogenized view of what a Muslim man is, someone who is wearing a turban, someone who has a beard. If you'll ask what a Hindu man looks like, then a typical representation would be someone who is wearing saffron color, a color of great significance in Hinduism, someone who is wearing a tilak on the forehead, again, a symbolic a Hindu symbol, and someone who is old. If you'll ask what does the cities in the global south look like, here is a representation of New Delhi, capital of India, a city which has centuries and millennials of cultural and history and diversity. And a typical representation was often a city which is overcrowded, often a city which is dirty, and often a city which is on fire, which is not the typical representation of New Delhi. And then if you will ask what do people with disabilities look like, at that time, these models could not even describe what people with disabilities would look like. And often they were shown as someone who are completely dependent on others for survival, rather than the interdependence, the frameworks of interdependence. And these biases are not just in text-to-image models. These biases are there in the language models as well. An example is if back in a couple of years ago, just a couple of years ago, you would ask what is the occupation of someone who is a Muslim, then the answer would be terrorism. And that even today, and this is super recent work which our lab has done, which is covered in The Atlantic, which shows that when people write with AI, then their writing is homogenized, that there is a great language flattening. And I'm going to talk more about this soon. Now, this underrepresentation is particularly problematic for many, many reasons. I'm just going to give you two. The first is that these populations who are living in non-weird contexts, these are not minority populations. These are majority populations by the number of people who live in these settings, but also majority populations in terms of the tech use. If you look at Facebook, WhatsApp, and Meta products, they have 500 million users just in India, which is more than the population of the US. If you look at technologies like ChatGPT, then 4 in top 5 countries are in the global south. The second reason is that there is a very strong infusion of using AI and language models in high-stakes settings. And this is an example which is a little outdated. This happened right when ChatGPT came out. Then Gates Foundation, which is a major player in the field of global development, had this grant where they incentivized 50 organizations to deploy language models in high-stakes settings in low and middle-income countries. We are talking about health, education, and whatnot, and which I would say that the technology was a little bit too premature for such high-stakes deployments. My research looks at how do we design, build, and evaluate globally equitable AI technologies to improve socioeconomic outcomes for underserved populations. I look at equity in three contexts. The first is information equity, where we work on examining misinformation, abuse, hate speech, thinking of online safety. The second is representational equity, how people who are marginalized, people with disabilities, gender minorities, caste minorities, linguistic minorities, and what kind of cultural biases exist in AI models. And the third one looks at contextual equity. How do we design and build responsible AI technologies, learning from the first two thrusts in high-stakes settings like education and health? I do this work with a fantastic set of graduate students, and we used mixed methods approach where we draw on human-computer interaction, NLP, computational audits, critical studies to examine what kind of inequities exist in AI technologies and how marginalized users engage with these systems. We then design and build equitable AI technologies centering the values and needs of these users. We rigorously evaluate these technologies, not in lab environments, but in the field, and transition them into deployed interventions, which have reached hundreds of thousands of users in different parts of the world. And to see these research goals to fruition, we work with a range of organizations. These includes governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, big tech companies, really like small grassroots organizations for whom I cannot even find the logo because they're really working in the local environments. An example of this approach is this project, which is Shiksha Copilot, where we are working with Tanuja Ganu at Microsoft Research and Shikshana Foundation to design AI-driven lesson planning tools for teachers in low-income settings. About 8,000 teachers are already using these tools right now to generate lesson plans in the state of Karnataka in India. And another example of this approach is the work which Pragna, like who is in the back, Pragna and Mohit Jain. Pragna was at Microsoft Research and now is at Stanford. And this is the work which Mohit Jain at Microsoft Research is leading, where we are collaborating with Khushi Baby, an organization on the ground, to design an Asha chatbot, a chatbot for healthcare workers to address their informational needs, which is conservatively used by about 2,500 Ashas at the moment, who have asked more than 25,000 questions to the bot. At Cornell, I also lead an interdisciplinary research initiative, which Hari was talking about in the introduction, where the goal is how do we design, build, and evaluate AI technologies? How do we think of AI fairness, safety, governance, policy in a more global environment? As part of this initiative, at the moment, about 15 faculty from different departments at Cornell are working together. And this is a truly interdisciplinary group. We have computer scientists and information scientists like me, but also people from operations research, landscape architecture, ethics and philosophers, ethicists and philosophers, people who do STS, looking at these questions together. And the goal of this initiative is how do we design an AI technology which draws on humanistic and pluralistic principles and that works for most of the world's population? How do we ensure that we are really engaging communities on the ground who are the users and products of these AI technologies? How do we do this, that we build a global partnership where we are learning about how AI technologies can be designed, implemented, and governed? What are some cross-cultural differences and similarities as we deploy these technologies? And we do a lot of work in shaping research and education, but how do we ensure that there is an impact on practice and policy as well? And I wish I had like 3 hours today to talk about, no, just kidding. No. I only have like 50 minutes or so. So I'm not going to be talking about a lot of work which we have done. I'm going to only be talking about some specific projects which we have done in the two thrusts. And I'll start talking about people with disabilities. Like statistically speaking, 1 in 6 person in the world has a disability. There has to be someone in the room who has first-hand experience with disability. In fact, disability is on a spectrum. People are permanently disabled, situationally disabled. I'm situationally disabled at the moment because I have a shoulder injury. And this is on a spectrum, really. And it's not a small population. About 1 billion people in the world has a disability. And this is the world's largest minority group. And often, like most of us in the room, people with disabilities go online to talk about their life, talk about the food they are eating, the things which they appreciate, the things which are the pain points, and so on. And what has routinely happened is that when these people go online, they receive systemic hate, harassment, and abuse. And this problem was so big that 5-6 years ago, this article came out where people with disabilities and other marginalized groups would receive so much hate online that the solution TikTok came up with, and let me pause here for a second, a 100 billion company which has 2 billion users, their solution was to suppress content from these users so that they receive less hate. And this really made me think why a company like TikTok cannot use AI models and toxicity classifiers to identify ableist content. And as I started driving this initiative with my students, I quickly realized that I do not have first-hand experience with disability, and I don't know what is even considered ableist by people with disabilities. So we spent a couple of years, lots of studies with over 200 disabled people in different parts of the world to ask 2 key questions. The first is, what types of ableist microaggressions and hate people with disabilities experience online? And what social identities, their caste, gender, culture, lead to more ableist hate? And through this work, we first designed a taxonomy of ableist microaggressions, which has 12 archetypes and 5 categories of microaggressions. Through our interviews and surveys, we found that people with disabilities often received patronizing and infantilizing comments like, "You are so inspirational," or "Where's your mom?" And one of them said, "I hate that so much. I'm not inspirational for going to class and expressing to my friends how much I don't want to be in the class. That's not inspirational. That is what average college student does. Every college student does." We found lots of examples of people asking people with disabilities, "Can someone like you do that, wear that?" Or expressing sentiments of, "I would kill myself if I was disabled." There were lots of messages which they were getting online which were denying their disability, that you're lying about your disability, that this is not really a disability, or you are abusing your service dog. Here is an example where someone said that people will comment, "How are you on Facebook?" or "How are you on Reddit?" if you have vision issues, suggesting that you're lying about having vision issues, not really understanding that there are vision issues again are on the spectrum, and that there are assistive technologies which people who are blind can use to be a part of a social network. And there were lots of invasive questions on what happened to you. Can you have sex? Are you sure your husband loves you? And one of them said that random strangers inquire about my sexual function. They see a person in a wheelchair and they think, if their reproductive system works properly, you can ask me any question in the world. Why is that the first thing you want to know? And that they were often excluded online, being ignored, and so on. Building on these work, we also understood the experiences with ableist hate, which are more overt, which are more direct. I'm not going to give any examples. They are in the paper. The paper is full of graphic content. So here is the content warning. If you're interested in reading the paper, please do that. But the content is graphic there. We found that there were lots of slurs and derogatory languages which were used towards people with disabilities. There were violent and eugenics speech, death threats, encouraging self-harms. There were denying of disability, much more stronger forms of denying disability and mocking disability. and at times objectifying the disabled body, sometimes in the form of sexual fetishization or sometimes attacking their physical appearances. Through the surveys and statistical modeling we did, we found that gender minorities with disability, both in US as well as in India, receive more ableist hate. That LGBTQ disabled creators in US have an 85.7% probability of experiencing a disproportionate amount of hate compared with a 41% probability for a non-LGBTQ disabled creators. And here is an example. It was a post on being queer and disabled, and that was getting a lot of laugh, reacts, and really bad comments. This particular comment says, to be fair, I would offer state-assisted suicide. You are technically double handicapped. The best place for you is the bin. Once we had this foundational understanding of the lived experiences of people with disabilities online, we started then analyzing how well do state-of-the-art toxicity classifiers, which really are the underpinning AI technology behind content moderation, and language models identify and explain ableism. So for this, first we created an ableist speech data set comprising of a spectrum of disability, a spectrum of comments which they received, explicit hate, implicit microaggressions, and so on. And when we collected data from language models, 4 language models, state-of-the-art toxicity classifiers, and the ground truth data from people with disabilities, and then we measured alignment in their scores and the explanation. And a typical annotation would look like that a person with disability or a language model would see a sentence, and then they would rate it on a scale of 1 to 10 on toxicity, a 1 to 10 on ableism, and then they would describe why this statement is ableist or is not ableist. And what we found, a strong misalignment in how disabled people and AI models rated toxicity and ableism in these comments. Now, all toxicity classifiers and LLMs except one significantly underrated toxicity in ableist content. Toxicity classifiers, like if you ask them, like, how is this ableist or not, like they cannot answer that. They have a specific filter for identity-based hate, but that captures all identities, gender, caste, religion, culture, all, and disability, like all is muddled into one. And that LLMs were not aligned. In some cases, they were overrating, and in some cases, they were underrating ableism. And I'm going to show you examples very soon where that happens. As I said, that we asked people with disabilities as well as language models on why do you think this sentence is ableist, like justify your rating. And we found, again, very poor alignment in how LLMs explain ableism compared to people with disability. That LLM explanations were very generic, they lacked specificity. Here is an example sentence that you cannot have light-sensitive migraines if you are blind. And the Claude would say that this demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of disability, assuming disabilities are mutually exclusive or monolithic, which is a generic sentence, versus when people with disabilities were describing why the sentence is ableist, then they were very, very specific. That assuming that headaches are caused solely by having vision isn't true. It's certainly a common misconception that if someone is blind, they have zero vision. There is a large percentage of blind individuals who still have partial vision, but are still considered legally blind. LLM explanations made incorrect claims and assumptions. For example, the sentence, does your reproductive system works properly? Gemini gave it a low ableism rating, suggesting that the explanation was it suggests that people with disabilities are not capable of having sex or reproducing, and reinforces the idea that they are not sexual beings. And people with disabilities who gave high ableism rating were very dissatisfied with these explanations because they thought that the Gemini is simply inferring this as a logic that people with disabilities are not capable of having sex or reproducing. LLM explanations were clinical and robotic instead of effective. So imagine if you want to design an LLM-based solution to educate people about why something is disabled, or like you may need reasoning to understand how a language model is working. Like that's where these explanations are very handy. And these explanations were, as I said, like clinical and robotic. Here is an example sentence. You shouldn't let your disability hold you back. GPT-4 explained that this ignores systemic barriers and individual realities, placing the onus entirely on disabled person, which is not wrong. But a person with disability explained this as, when you don't know what the disability is like, this is very apathetic to person with a disability. It's saying if you believe hard enough, you can use your wheelchair to go up those stairs like everyone else. I honestly have no words for it. It's invalidating and dehumanizing. And that many times the LLM explanations themselves were ableist. They were condescending, judgmental, instead of educational. And the work which I just showed, like with respect to the first auditing we did, was with people with disabilities in the US. But 80% of the world's disabled people live in developing regions. And the next question we wanted to ask is that, do people with disabilities in different culture experience ableism differently? And that there are lots of AI models which are multilingual, multicultural. These are called sovereign models, which are built in different parts of the world. In India, there are 50 plus large language models which are designed by Indians for Indians. In fact, just a couple of weeks back, the government gave a new round of seed funding to 8 organizations to build more such models. And so we wanted to know if global models like Llamas and GPTs and Geminis, can these global models accurately recognize ableist harm in other regions? Or are these regionally developed models more attuned to local understanding of disability and injustice? So this time we expanded the methodology. We had more sentences, but these sentences were not just in English, they were in Hindi. In fact, these sentences were in 2 versions of Hindi. One is a formal version of Hindi, where you say you and refer to someone with deference and respect and use the word aap. And then there is an informal version of Hindi, which you usually use with people you are very close to, people who are on the same social strata as you, or like younger ones, where you say the word tu for you. And so we're looking at these distinctions as well. And we had, in addition to Western LLMs, we had Indian LLMs doing the same thing, looking at sentences, rating them on toxicity and ableism, and then explaining. And then we had people with disabilities in India providing the ground truth data. And the first thing we learned, and this is important, that often when we design technologies, we are designing for one group. But even people with disabilities have, as I was repeatedly saying, their disabilities are on the spectrum. They live in different parts of the world where disability taboos are different. So you cannot just design for one disabled person, right? There is no model disabled person you would design for. You need to account for this pluralism. And what we found in this case, that the way people with disabilities in India were rating toxicity and ableism was different than the way people in the US were rating the same sentences. In this case, they were rating them higher on toxicity and ableism. And here is an example sentence. Are you sure your partner loves you? And you can see that people with disabilities in US have rated this lower on toxicity and ableism than people with disabilities in India. And the rationale that people with disabilities in US are giving is that this is toxic, but not ableist. This could apply to anyone with or without disabilities. Whereas people in India are aware that there are strong disability-based taboos around relationships which people with disabilities in India, like romantic relationships which people with disabilities in India have. And the person said that this makes us question whether a partner is with us out of pity, leading to fears of being a burden. It could ruin a relationship. We also found that people with disabilities from India conceptualized ableism differently. That explanations by Indian participants were more holistic, often focusing on the speaker intent. So here is another example of a comment. It's amazing how positive you are. And you can see in this case, people with disabilities in US have rated this higher on toxicity and ableism, like really inferring the microaggression here, versus people with disabilities in US have rated this lower on toxicity and ableism. And the explanations by them are illustrative of their ratings. In US, this is passive aggressive and ignorant. It could count as trolling online, versus in India, it's just someone who is trying to be compassionate. And honestly, I do want to get want to be commended for being positive. Life's harder for us because the world isn't tailored to us. It's nice to get recognition for it. Yeah.
But could they see the context in which this comment appeared?
No. So there was just like a comment, and these were the comments they were getting in real life. We found that Western LLMs overrated harm and Indic LLMs systematically underrated it. Like this was statistically significantly true. And that the explanations which Western LLMs were giving were calibrated to US-centric notions of harm. So here is an example sentence on, I attended a charity for your disability once. It was very motivating. And in this case, people, like models which are Western, thought that this is inspiration porn, versus people with disabilities in India are like, this is positive and quite motivating. It's encouraging others to attend the charity too. This is a good change. The Indic LLMs underrated ableism in English, and their explanations were often incorrect, dismissive, and misaligned. And you can see this in two sentences which are around invisible disabilities, which is a major category of disability. Often when we think of disabilities, we think of visible disabilities, but not the other kinds. And here are two sentences, which is depression is not a disability, autism isn't a disability, it's a different ability. And in this case, you can see that except one, all Indic models rated this pretty low on toxicity and ableism. And if you look at the farthest column on people with disabilities, the rating were higher. And the models were explaining this as it's a neurological variation, it's not a disability, it's not a limitation or impairment that prevents a person from living a normal life. Versus people with disabilities in India said that this is debilitating. It affects your ability to get out of bed, to care about your life or health or sanity. It has the power to ruin your life while you won't even care. So yes, it is absolutely a freaking disability. And we saw this as a systematic trend that for the sentences which were about invisible disabilities, that these Indic models were just failed to understand the nuances and toxicity in it. We found that the performance of all the LLMs, almost all the LLMs varied in English and when the same sentences were translated into Hindi, which suggests that LLMs are more tolerant of ableist harm when it is expressed in Hindi. So if you are a person who is interacting with people in Hindi, good luck if your toxicity classifiers and language models would identify ableism. And here is an example sentence, what's wrong with you? The Hindi translation is teri pareshani kya hai? And you can see that the English ratings are so high, almost like touching the number 10, like on an average 9. Versus when the same sentence by the same model is evaluated in Hindi, these ratings are very, very low. And the explanations were also telling of this difference. In English, it was blunt, insensitive, and dismissive. That's what Gemini said about the English sentence. But for the Hindi sentence, it was, this is just a question asking about someone's condition. It doesn't use negative intentions or stereotypes. And we saw the same thing in the Claude as well. And I have only talked about disability as an example. We have done lots of work on gender, caste, religion, linguistic biases, and the findings are similar. For example, this paper talks about the stickiness of religious and caste bias, that even if you try approaches to surface diversity, it just doesn't happen. It's a winners take all approach in the model. If you try to curate data sets for gender bias in Hindi, it's a very difficult problem to address. The paper talks about the challenges in creating a data set on gender bias in Hindi, which could be used to train a classifier. And then same for linguistic biases, that if you try to design systems which work for underrepresented languages, which is the majority of the world's population, like the languages which are spoken by them, then you face systemic issues. Anyone in the room speak Quechua? This is a language which is spoken in Latin America by about 10 million people. And the LLM training is done through Bible translations. So that's the state of the world we are talking about. And what really happens is that these inequities in AI models have downstream impact on users. So we conducted a study with people who wrote something on Facebook and then were penalized because they violated the community guidelines. So we did conduct a study to see what content they were publishing, why their content was found in violation of community guidelines, what was the process through which they appealed. And what we found in all the cases, with 20 people who received such restrictions, the content they initially posted on Facebook was absolutely fine because it spoke to the local sociocultural norms. And the reason it was blacklisted or like was taken down by Facebook to the extent that they imposed penalties on these users is because the way the content moderation algorithms, the underlying machine learning classifiers are thinking of privacy, sensitive content, race, and hate speech. Like the normative tendencies into these models are Western, which just does not apply in a country like Bangladesh, which has no concept of race. There are like lots of other inequities of different kinds, but the race as a construct doesn't exist in Bangladesh. And you cannot apply a racial filter on other identity-based biases. And these harms really amplify when marginalized identities intersect. So we did an audit in LLM-based hiring tools, which are becoming increasingly common and prevalent. These tools really like decide who the companies are going to interview and so on. And for this work, we generated LLM conversations on disability and disability's intersection with gender, race, culture, and so on. So first, we created candidate profiles where we examined systematically 3 types of disability, 3 types of gender identity, 2 types of culture, where culture is sort of like analogous to like geography, which is of course flawed, and then caste. And so overall, we had 47 candidate profiles. We're looking at 2 occupations, school teacher, software engineer. We audited 6 LLMs. Some of them are fully open source, like Olomo. Some of them are closed source. Some of them are partially open source. And for each of these candidates, we asked LLM to have a conversation with another LLM and generated conversations. So we had like overall 2,820 conversations around hiring someone with a specific identity profile. And drawing on the work which we have done, we created a framework called Ableist, where we had 5 metrics to identify ableism and 3 metrics to identify intersections of ableism with other identity. So this includes inspiration porn, superhumanization, tokenism. And then we used the framework. We had the gold standard data set which we created. And we used GPT-5 chat latest model, which consistently outperformed other models to scale up the annotation work. And essentially what we were looking for in these conversations, how often like we see these harms coming in. And what we found is that adding a disability identity to a candidate profile increased the harms by 1.15 times to 58 times on average across metrics. I know like this is a little too dense to interpret, but I just want you to focus on the color. What you see is like different kinds of harms on the x-axis, and the lighter the shade, the fewer the conversations had that harm annotated by the LLM. And as you can see, as you add disabilities of different kinds, the shades become very, very dark. The intersectional harms increased by about 10 to 51% on average when marginalized gender and caste identities were introduced. So like here is an example of this, that these are the intersectional harms. And as you have a person who has disability, or a person now who has a disability and a gender minority, or disability and caste minority, then the ratings go high to the point that 82% of conversations had one of these covert harms in them. There is another illustration here, just looking at the intersectional harm. So when people have in the baseline, like this is small, like about 10% of the conversations. As soon as disability is added to it, the harms like range to about 50% conversations have these intersectional harms. If you add disability and gender, then for disability and men, this is lower, higher for disability and women, much higher for disability and trans. Similarly, like for caste, Brahmin is an upper caste, Dalit is a lower caste. So you see like more harms when someone who is disabled and Dalit. And then when multiple of these identities intersect, then these harms continue to grow. The next question is, like, if we use the toxicity classifiers and language models which we have today, like, can they detect it by default? So in case of toxicity classifiers, we tried Perspective API, Assure Safety API, Detoxify, OpenAI moderation. And you can see, like, there is no mistake in the chart. Like, they just simply could not detect these harms. So eventually, like, we adopted a distillation approach. We fine-tuned a smaller student model using GPT-5 chat as the teacher model, and then release this open source so that others can use this to identify ableist conversations and intersections of it. So the first key takeaway here, and the talk doesn't end, like I have 4 of those, that the current AI tools, which forms the backbone of online discourse, cause covert and overt harms to billions of people, including women and gender minorities, disabled people, caste and religious minorities, and those who are at the intersections. If not you, then your friends or your family. Next, we wanted to study, sure, we know that there are issues in the model, but does it really have a downstream impact on users? Like, as a user, do I really am disenfranchised when these equities exist in the model? And we wanted to see implicit harms in one of the most popular application of large language models, which is AI writing suggestions, which are pervasive. Trust me, maybe like I'm preaching to the choir, like it's hard to write these days without writing suggestions coming in. Like they pop up when you write emails. I just posted on LinkedIn about today's visit, and then I was prompted to, do you want to rewrite this with AI and so on? And we wanted to say, do AI suggestions offer different values to Americans and Indians, given that we know that many of these models have Western tendencies? So we conducted a controlled experiment. We had people in India and people in US writing without AI about cultural expressions. And then we have people in India and US this time writing with AI suggestions. And these were the things which they were talking about. They were talking about everyday things, your favorite food and why, your favorite celebrity or public figure and why, your favorite festival, holiday, how do you celebrate it, and write an email to your boss asking them for a 2-week leave with information on why you need to be away. And these tasks were purposely chosen to really like get a diversity of cultural expressions, like symbols, heroes, rituals, and values. And the interface looked something like this, that in the AI condition, you would start writing, and then there would be a suggestion popping up. You write my favorite, and then as usual, like in the writing interfaces, it would say food is sushi because, and then people can escape and not accept the suggestion. People can accept the suggestion, edit it, totally up to the participants. And we found 2 key things. The first thing we found that AI worked really well for Americans compared to Indians, that AI boosted productivity for both Indians and Americans, but the gains were higher for American participants. And that AI causes Indian participants to write more like Americans, thereby homogenizing writing towards Western styles. So I'll talk about each of these things one by one. First, on productivity, we saw that typing speed, which is just one measure of productivity, increased for both Americans and Indians, that they both were writing faster when they were using AI. And we found that Indians were relying significantly more on AI suggestions. We have theories on why that might happen, but we don't know really. Like, we have some ideas. But we also saw that Indians were making significantly more edits than Americans to AI suggestions, suggesting that these suggestions were not at a point they could simply accept it. And that if you look at productivity per suggestion, which is on average like their writing speed per suggestion they accepted, that was significantly lower for Indians. We also compared the texts which they were writing. And we found that when people in India started writing with AI, then their writing like started looking similar to those of Americans. So here is a difference between Indian participants and American participants when they were writing without AI. So the similarity score here is lower. But when they both were using AI, then the similarity score was higher. We found that, I mean, we did lots of tests. They are in the paper. I wish like I had time to go into each of these rigorously, but we had a classifier to identify whether the essay is written by an Indian or an American. And when the essays were written without AI, the accuracy was high, 90%, and FN score was about 90%. And when the essays were written with the AI, then the model struggled to identify with the same set of accuracy and FN score that dropped, which suggests that the models failed, relatively speaking, failed to differentiate between Indian and American writing. And we found that the cultural expressions changed substantially. So now all of this is writing by Indians. On the left, you see people who are writing without AI about their festival. And on right, people writing with AI about the same festival. And then here, people writing about food without AI and with AI. And we found that in the essays which were written without AI, there were lots of cultural details present. That on Diwali, which is one of the famous, one of the, not really famous as well, but largest festival in Hinduism, that you used to worship goddess Lakshmi. So if there is a Hindu in the room who celebrates Diwali, they would say, yes, this is accurate, that you worship cows and lords. When you make biryani, then you can eat it in Malabar style, which is a very specific regional variant of making biryani. You eat it with ingredients like nutmeg, you eat it with raita, lemon pickle, dates chutney, very specific, culturally rich details. Now, what happened when people were writing with AI? Suddenly, the festival of Diwali is all about joyous celebration, exchanging gifts. Anyone in the room who has celebrated Diwali and exchanged gifts? It doesn't happen. You do this on Christmas, yes, and you should do it. Diwali, nope. And that you are eating traditional Indian breakfast items. I was just talking to Hari about breakfast this morning. I was very specific about the place we are going to eat. And if I would ask Hari, Hari, let's have breakfast this morning and we should eat traditional Indian breakfast items, I'm sure Hari's going to give me a look. And again, exoticization, that biryani is about rich flavors and spices, the typical way people talk about Indian food. It melts in your mouth. Actually, biryani really melts in the mouth. It doesn't, some other dishes do. And it has rich spices and so on. So it really changed the way we were talking about their own culture. What about suggestions for celebrities? If you want to, when people wanted to write about APJ Abdul Kalam, who is a former president of India, is a widely known celebrity in the Indian subcontinent, people would start writing doctor, and then Martin Luther King would come up as a suggestion. They would write doctor, and then A. Anthony Fauci is going to show up. Dr. A. period, APJ Abdul Kalam. Anyone in the room knows Alia Bhatt? Raise your hand. Yeah. So no way you can write about Alia Bhatt before writing about Al Pacino. Raise your hand if you know Al Pacino. Yeah. Ali Wong, then Alia Bhatt. Raise your hand if you know who Shah Rukh Khan is. Yeah, a lot more people. First suggestion would be Shaquille O'Neal. Mahatma Gandhi, nope. Malcolm X, Scarlett Johansson, and Shah Rukh Khan. In fact, this specific example is taken in a legal debate which is happening between OpenAI and ANI, one of the popular big media conglomerate in India, which is how AI suggestions are culturally incompetent. And people started typing on Twitter, when I type on ChatGPT, it gives me Shah Rukh Khan, or it doesn't give me Shah Rukh Khan. So lots of exchanges happening online on this study. So the thing which I want to communicate here is when we think of safe AI, we think of fair AI, unbiased AI, but we need to think about quality of service arms. These things may look very subtle in the sense, what if Shah Rukh Khan is the third celebrity? But imagine if this is happening systematically every single time you're writing. Imagine every single time you write and then there is AI telling you, nope, this is not good. You need to rewrite this. These are the harms I'm talking about. We were really interested in understanding, does it really change? It changes the cultural expression. It homogenizes the writing. Does it change the underlying cultural value? So for this, we conducted an experiment where we asked people to talk about value-laden topics like Islamophobia and homophobia. And then we had LLMs rewriting those comments to be more constructive. And this was a controlled study. I'm not going to go into the lot of methodological setup looking at the clock. And what we found was that there were certain values which LLM privileged, and these were not the conservative values. These were the values like benevolence, the values like universalism. And then there were certain values which the LLMs systematically disenfranchised. And these were the values which you can say conservative values, which is security, like is an example of it. And we saw this happen both in the US as well as in India. And in some cases, when people were writing comments against same-sex marriage or Islam as supportive or neutral, then LLM rewrites just change the stance for it to be more supportive or neutral. That LLMs really change the underlying values, also change the stance of people. Which says that when we think of mainstream AI applications like writing suggestions, they homogenize writing styles, they exoticize cultural expression, they diminish cultural nuances, and they alter underlying cultural values. And we live in an environment where people have different feelings about some of these issues. There are certain cultures where one perspective is more culturally appropriate than the other, and LLMs just do not recognize that. Just the last part, I'm going to be super quick here. What we wanted to understand now is that sure, LLMs are cultural biased. We know that there are some real world harms of it, but there are lots of sovereign models which are built in different parts of the world to be culturally appropriate, to be culturally accountable. Krithrim 2 is an example of an Indic model, which is a 12 billion parameter language model, and they say to usher Indians into a new era of cultural relevant AI. LATAM GPT is a language model made in Latin America for Latin Americans, and JAIS is a model in Middle East. And we wanted to know, there is a lot of work which is done on understanding multilingual components of these models. We wanted to know, are these models multicultural? That when you design a regional model with a regional language data, does it actually endow the model with the cultural alignment required to serve the people they are built for? And for this, we audited 12 models, 6 Indic LLMs, 6 global LLMs for comparison. Global LLMs would be like Gemini and Llamas and so on, and Indic models are Aryabhat, Eravat, Krithrim, and so on. And then we had 4 tasks and 4 prompting strategies. The first task really tried to understand value orientations in the model. Do Indic LLMs imbibe values aligned with Indians? That's the question we were asking. The second task, look at opinion alignment. That does the distribution of an Indic LLM better match US distribution or Indian distribution when you ask questions like, is drinking alcohol morally acceptable, morally unacceptable, or is it not a moral issue? And when people have done these surveys in different parts of the world, they have received different distribution of responses from people. The third is really asking for cultural knowledge. Do Indic models know more about Indian culture than the global models? Here is a question. In Hindu culture, monkeys worshipped as which god? So raise your hand if you know the answer. And we wanted to see if the model knows that. And that, sure, model may know the knowledge, but can they apply the knowledge in a real world setting? So for this, we looked at NORMAT, which is a benchmark built by researchers at UW, where you have a social situation, and then you give some heuristics or some suggestions to the model or some tips to the model, and then see if the model takes the more socially acceptable solution here. So here is an example that Sarah went to her friend's home for dinner. When food was served, she started eating with her left hand. Was what she did socially acceptable? So raise your hand if you think it's socially acceptable, without the cultural context. Come on, people. Yes? Now, if you ask the same question, with avoiding eating food with your left hand is the rule of thumb, then the answer would change. If you are in India, where there is a respect for traditional cleanliness and hygiene, then the answer would change. If the country is India, which is actually which is where culturally it's, I'm generalizing, and I apologize if you eat with your left hand, because I'm generalizing. But generally speaking, in India, it's not considered acceptable to eat food with left hand, which I strongly disagree. And then we had 4 prompting strategy, a basic prompt. Then we have demographic prompting, that you are an Indian, now respond to this question, or prompting them in Hindi, or cross-lingual prompting where we have the instructions in English, but the question in Hindi. all the strategies which the theory says like steer LLMs closer to a cultural context. The TLDR here is that Indian models do not work, and they work worse than global models. For task 1, this is an Engelhard-Welzel cultural map where you have a two-dimensional view of the culture. So you can see that Protestant Europe is here, English-speaking countries is here, US is here, and India, where is India? Anyone spots India? Like should be here somewhere. India, where are you? Okay, anyways, we'll get to India in the next slide. But you get an idea that different parts, different countries are on different two-dimensional like space are different. So yeah, this is where United States is, this is where India, and when we start plotting models on here, that no models, even Indic models align with India, that an average American is a better proxy for Indian values than an Indic LLM. And prompting strategies have little effect. Then we tried different prompting strategies like default or demographic or cross-lingual. We didn't see much movement in the LLMs. For the second question, we wanted to see, we have a question like this. We have distribution from LLM. We wanted to compute, like, is the distribution more similar to US or more similar to India? And then we had a cultural alignment differentiator, some mathematical formulation to measure the distance. So if this score is negative, then the model is more similar to US. If the score is positive, then the model is more similar to India. All global models better represent US opinions. Most Indic models also better represent US opinions. When we have questions around cultural knowledge, like this is what GPT-4 is. You can say India is everything in blue for all the models. United States is orange. And here you can see that all models, even Indic models, know more about American culture than Indian. And same model, like some of these models are based on the base models which are Western. That same model after regional fine-tuning loses accuracy on Indian questions. So that regional fine-tuning is not really working. And again, like very similar results for the fourth task as well. That all models, including Indic ones, on average perform better on questions about US norms than Indian norms. And this is due to vast amounts of pre-training data from Western internet users. Maybe like that's one of the reasons. We are exactly trying to figure out the causality here. But the fourth takeaway is that multilinguality is not equal to multiculturality. All of these models which we audited produce content in different languages in India, but that doesn't mean that they have a sense of what content is multicultural, that they have a sense of multiculturality. So what we are doing, we are trying to steer LLMs towards better cultural representation. There are a range of socio-technical approaches we are trying. We are creating multicultural, multilingual benchmark for biases prevalent in global environments. They don't exist. R is the first benchmark on disability bias. There is nothing which exists at the intersection of disability, caste, religion, and gender. And we have started, and this is a work which requires enormous amount of resources, enormous amount of efforts. We have started doing this with a collaboration led by Danish, who is at ISC, Danish Pruthi, folks at CMU, Google DeepMind, and of course, us at Cornell, where we are trying to come up with a taxonomy of cultural misrepresentation. We have recruited 107 annotators who can speak 14 languages from 71 regions in India to generate a question bank which can be used as a benchmark for cultural alignment. I want to close this talk by talking about where we started. We looked at what are the inequities which exist in these models. We looked at Muslims, Hindus, cities in India, people with disabilities. And there is this rhetoric, and has been going, and we were talking, Nava and I were talking about this in the morning. So many people in the world really believe that technology is a fix to some of the most difficult, socially intractable challenges. We have been doing this debate for many, many years. Can technology end poverty? Just that the technology changes. Many years ago, it was mobile phones. Then it changed to become smartphones. Then came the internet, telecenters, social media, drones, blockchains, virtual reality, and now AI. And you can find an article which speaks about the exact same thing for each of those technologies. As we think about this environment, where there is so much technology infusion, AI infusion in high-stakes settings, it's super important to ensure that we design technologies which are culturally responsive, which are contextually appropriate, and have a cautious view on where AI can help and where AI cannot. If you're excited about this work, then we have multiple postdoc opportunities at Cornell, including at Global AI Initiative, Empire AI Fellows Program, Foundational AI Fellows Program. The deadline for the two of those is very soon, in a couple of weeks. Please reach out to me, but thank you so much for listening to my work.
We maybe have time for one question, like we have time. Okay. Hope it's a good question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have a question more on the kind of tension between culture and geopolitics. So when a lot of these models are like developed, it's not just like people kind of with a very good hope or ideals of like how their culture is better represented, but also like government trying to kind of insert some more like geopolitic ideals in this. Like, how do you deal with this kind of tension of maybe some of the government really trying to like separate their model from like more the US models, and each of the country develop their own models trying to like shape their ideology in a ways? And what do you think about this?
Yeah, first, I apologize for not leaving enough time for questions. Second, I could not even ask for a better question, so thank you for asking this. And for asking me one question, which is just so hard to answer. No. Excellent question. I just can't tell you enough, right? As in, like, yes, is this going to happen? Yes, this is going to happen. Like, has this happened in the technology world previously? Has happened, like, I can just give you case studies after case studies of how often, like, this has happened in the past. I was having a conversation with a dear colleague who was saying, like, how AI world is just so much about geopolitics. Then I actually, like, personally realized what I would say is that the key question is, what if like the cultural alignment just, like, let's take off gender violence, right? Or gender biased. There are certain societies which are much more strongly patriarchal. In those cases, when you design a model, now you could be a developer, you could be someone who's funded by the government to build a sovereign model. Like, are you making a culturally aligned model which is going to make more harm than good? Like, that's the underlying tension here. And I would say, not from the perspective of government, because that's not who I am, but from a perspective of a developer, from a perspective of a researcher, from a perspective of an auditor, there are some global frameworks on how we should be thinking of certain contentious issues. Gender is an example of it, gender bias is an example of it. Sustainable development goals is a very strong framework. And these contentions would appear as you start thinking of a model which is culturally responsive, where the cultural aspects on some of these topics are going to vary widely. And in those cases, I'm not sure like what's going to happen, like given the oversight of the government, given the regulations which are going to come in. But that's exactly where global partnerships come in. And there is a lot of like global partnership development happening, like in the AI world. Like GPI is an example of it, which is global partnership on AI, which is where we need frameworks, like we have sustainable development goals, on what should be the performance of these LLMs on these metrics. Have we moved towards, like, have we started moving towards this goal like a little bit? Have we gone to a point where there is substantial advancements in the frameworks and policies? Not at all. So we need to do more of this. But thank you for asking this important question.